You are now entering Nick and Mello's hyperspace.
I'm Nick, and I think my favorite political story in Star Wars has to be the fight for clones' rights in season 2 of The Bad Batch.
I'm Carmelo, and I adore the revolutionary politics of Andor. I was just wowed, just wowed.
In our journey through hyperspace, we examine everything and anything Star Wars from the point of view of two lifelong fans, one young, one old, who came together through the will of the Force.
And in this episode, we are going to talk about politics. It's really interesting. When I started joining all these online groups about Star Wars, I realized that in the list of things that you're supposed to agree to before you join, in almost every group that I'm in, probably in every group that I'm in, it says no politics, no talking of politics. So when Nick and I were thinking of ideas for season 3 of Nick and Mel's Hyperspace, I thought it would be really nice to have a venue to talk about politics. And
Mhm.
so we are talking about politics today. We are not going to stay quiet and silent and content. And we want to divide the show in talking about politics in Star Wars, in the Star Wars narrative, and then also in how our politics in our world, the United States of America, in American culture, in 21st century politics, are reflected in Star Wars itself.
I love The Bad Batch, as it's been documented. And one of the things that I really, really enjoy about season 2 was what we talked about. It's a show about clones, really, for the first time. It's centered around the clones, not just here's a little arc about clones going on this mission. It's the life of a clone, especially life of a clone after war and the transition into a new government, kind of
Right,
new government oversight. And
right.
a lot of the clones, they're not being commissioned anymore for service. They're being kind of sidelined, and they're having to find a new purpose. And to me, that kind of hits home with how veterans are in this country. Of after the war, after your service is done, how do you readjust to normal life? Your life has been about fighting, and readjusting to everyday life is hard, and especially when a lot of times we're not taking care of those that's made that sacrifice or those services. And the Bad Batch highlighted that really well, I thought. With these people fought for us. What do we do with them now? We can't just
Right.
throw them aside. They don't have homes. They don't even have representation in the Senate. So I thought that was really cool. And Senator Chuchi, one of the best senators in Star Wars to
Woohoo!
me. Love her.
Yes, she's
Yeah, it was
great.
just a really fun little arc. Spoilers if you haven't seen it, but one of the unfortunate things is the Bad Batch. They do the right thing, and it still blows up in their face. And the messaging and the true intent of their cause, gets twisted, and that kind of leads to the creation of stormtroopers and
Right.
the expansion of the empire. So very sad, but also kind of a really hits home, I think, in a lot of real world spaces.
Very poignant. Yes. It's really interesting listening to you because those two episodes, they're in the middle of season 2. Those two episodes have sort of, it's almost like a double story because it is the story of veterans and the need for them to have a voice, a political voice in the new empire. But when every time I've seen those episodes several times because I really like them.
Mm-hmm.
But every time I see them, because in Star Wars, because Star Wars is a multi-species galaxy, and at least I think of clones as another species. They're human, but they're manufactured humans.
Right.
I always think of that story also as a story of the lack of representation of other ethnicities and races in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
or even other gender and sexuality issues.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could read those two episodes also as sort of the lack of representation in Congress from the LGBT community, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it's really fun to see that story from the point of view of clones as veterans, but also of clones as a different species or as a different community that exists in Star Wars. It's really a story about identity politics
Yeah.
in a very real way.
Another thing that really, not just those episodes of the Bad Batch, but as you're talking, I remembering right when the Bad Batch first starts, and they're talking about clones, their property, they're not people.
Yeah,
And I think a lot of times in our
yeah,
world, unfortunately, we forget with those marginalized communities that they're people. Um,
yep,
they may not have, being created and manufactured by our government, but they're sometimes treated as less than.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I think the Bad Batch highlights the really importance of that.
And I don't mean to jump to the second part of our episode, but I will anyway. The use of the word property in an American television show immediately calls slavery.
Exactly.
And so it is interesting that clones are not technically slaves, but the Kaminoans see them as property in the same way that that freed American thought of slaves as property all throughout the 19th century, until the Civil War and the abolition, and even after that.
Right.
But at least legally, they were free. And so it's interesting that even the choice of language about the clones sort of recalls these ideas about slavery, about representation, and about identity politics. The story of Black America in the 20th century is very much a story about identity politics, and the lack of
Even to this
political
day.
representation. Oh, even to this day, yes.
Even to this day, yeah.
Yes, I'm not saying that any of this is solved.
I know. I know. I just wanted to throw that in there.
And so, and there is LGBTQ representation in Congress today. I'm not saying that none of that exists, but that the clone story in season 2 really reminds me of that narrative arc of our country, and the way that identity politics relate to government and political representation.
Let's talk about Andor, because that's
Let's talk about. Oh, I can talk about Andor for
we can
hours.
talk about hours.
Oh,
we already did,
we're
but
so screwed.
but
No. You know, I continue. I'm going to say it the most frank way. I continue to be wowed that Star Wars fans are getting revolutionary rhetoric from Disney and Lucasfilm.
That's crazy.
There are moments in Andor where I am literally identify revolutionary political philosophers of the 20th century, like straight out of, maybe not word by word, but certainly many of the ideas of Lenin, of Antonio Gramsci, of Fidel Castro, all of those things, of Che Guevara. They're there. They're totally there. Read Che Guevara's Guerrilla Warfare. It's a little manual on how to make revolutions, and there are so many things that are inserted in Andor and done sort of within the context of Star Wars. And it's one of the things that I really enjoy about that sort of reflection of our world within the world, because it felt like Star Wars, but I've read those things, and it was just so interesting to identify all of that. It was so fun and so interesting to me to see the development of a revolutionary mind, and having Andor go from, I do not get involved, to I want to get involved in 12 beautiful, glorious episodes.
With 12 more on the way, which I'm excited about.
Sometime before we die.
Hopefully. I really enjoy, I think it was love-hate thing with Andor for me, because I didn't hate it at first, but it took me a while to warm up to it. And I've really warmed up to it over the last probably few months, or maybe last year. And I really enjoyed seeing the dirty, grimy, ugly side of war that when we talk about history, we talk about the look at the, we talk about the sacrifices, but don't really talk about the sacrifices of the people we don't know of the no names, the people that aren't going to be in the history books. And Andor documented that well. And one thing I really enjoy is seeing the gray area more so in Andor than I think any other Star Wars that we've gotten.
Yeah.
There's a great line that Mon Mothma said that when after the Aldhani heist, she said that people are suffering, and Luthen says, well, people are already suffering. And that kind of, it just is just a really fascinating take on two very extreme views of Star Wars. And then adding Saw Gerrera in the mix he's the poster boy for radicalism in Star Wars.
It's interesting seeing so many revolutions, especially in the 20th century. So many revolutions are actually begun by the middle class. We have this notion that it comes from below, that it comes from like the masses or But the Mexican Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, all of those, Fidel Castro was a baseball player, a middle class baseball player.
It's wild to think.
And so Zapata was a landowner. And so it's really interesting how Andor takes all of that, and sort of sees how, Luthen and Mon Mothma are people in positions.
Mhm.
These are not marginalized, ostracized no ones who are leading the rebellion. And so that's another really interesting moment of Andor, that we get to see, number one, how it works, but also, as you're saying, how complicated this is,
Right.
about making decisions about what is the right way of rebelling. And there's no right way, and there's lots of different ways of doing it.
I think that's what really makes Andor special, is because in the original trilogy we don't really get any of that at all. It's very black and white, very kind of straight to the point, simple.
Yep.
Not simple. I don't say simple in a bad way. Simple is good sometimes, but a simple good versus evil. There's an evil government. We're here to take them down and give people freedom back. But what we don't really get to see is at what point does it become, too high of a price? What are some sacrifices we have to make? What are sacrifices we can't make? Luthen, one of my favorite characters in Star Wars now, makes a lot of those sacrifices, not just for himself but for other people. Like the pilot Grieger, that he knows he's going to get destroyed, but if he knows if I tell him what's going to happen and he pulls back, Empire is going to be aware of what we're doing here, and we can't risk. We got to sacrifice these 50 men for the greater good. Who the hell can make those decisions? Like, those are hard decisions to make.
That the monologue of Luthen is one of those moments where I had already sort of decided to distance myself from him because of the way he was thinking of how to attack, how to fight the Empire. And then he gives us that speech.
Changes him completely for me.
That all of a sudden, instead of like, oh my God, like you talk about gray areas. To me, that's the moment where that character becomes four-dimensional, not three-dimensional, four-dimensional.
Yeah.
Because all of a
complex.
sudden, like, wow, this is where this is coming from.
There's a line that he says that makes me think of Hamilton, where he says, "I will." What does he? How does he say it exactly? Something about I'm not going to see. I'm fighting for a sunrise I'm never going to see. It makes me think of Hamilton, where he said, "I'm planting seeds of a garden I'll never grow."
Yeah.
And that's literally the story of Cassian Andor, of Rogue One.
Yes.
All these things.
Yes.
And Diego Luna was very upfront about that when he was promoting Andor in season 1, and really makes the sacrifices of those characters more important. I just love when Star Wars makes the original trilogy better. And that's what Rogue One does. It just makes it so much better for me.
It's really interesting in what you mentioned about in the original trilogy, we have this very clear notion of like, these are the bad guys, these are the good guys. And I was thinking about this episode a couple of days ago on my train ride home. And I was intrigued how in the original trilogy, war is battles. The Battle of Yavin, the Battle of Hoth, the Battle of Endor. But then when we get something like the television Clone Wars, we get the battles, but we also get everything else
that comes with those battles.
The politics, the government, the Senate, the sort of political maneuvering, the profiteers, the regular citizens. And so it's really interesting to see, I'm going to call it the evolution of Star Wars, from a notion in the original trilogy of, war as a good thing to bring peace and prosperity to the galaxy by destroying the Empire, to what are we doing?
Yeah.
In the Clone Wars, and then later in Rogue One, and later in the sequel trilogy, where the whole notion of politics and the whole idea of how politics relates to war is sort of fleshed out. I think it's really important, Nick, to talk about Phantom Menace and the backlash of sort of like, wait a minute, this is a Star Wars movie about taxation?
That's kind of really
like, welcome to the real world. Welcome to the real world.
That's really where it kind of like the stories like Andor and I think Bad Batch and Clone Wars kind of they kind of owe a lot of that to
Mhm,
the Phantom Menace for laying the groundwork and kind of
mhm,
planting those seeds of,
mhm.
oh, there is more to Star Wars than just good versus evil. It can be a little complex. It can be a little, gray.
I
Uh,
think one of the things that I am most grateful for in the prequel trilogy is to bring politics into the mix.
yeah,
Because wars are connected to politics. Are they're like first cousins. I have been delighted with the prequel trilogy, and then our wonderful 7 seasons of Clone Wars, and then Andor and Rogue One, where the notion of politics finally makes a presence that lets us understand a little bit more about the complexity of what it means to go to war,
mm-hmm,
and that this is not only a military decision, but that these are political decisions.
mm-hmm.
And to me, that's essential. I mean, that's when Star Wars really gets good, in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, not to get off on too much of a side tangent, you and I love the sequels a lot, but I really
Mhm.
think one of the biggest missed opportunities of the sequels was explaining how the New Republic, governs. What does it look like years after the Empire fell? And I'm glad we're getting that in Ahsoka and
The
Mandalorian.
Mandalorian, right?
We're getting to some of those gaps filled for
Yeah,
us.
yeah,
And I really always harp back on, I think it was in Ahsoka, or maybe it was Mando season 3. They're kind of overlapping at this point for me. But when Carson Teva goes to the New Republic, oh, it was about Navarro. That's right. When he
yeah.
goes to them to
Season
help,
three.
hey, we want to help Navarro. That you're being attacked by pirates, and Tim Meadows' character is like, oh, they're kind of outside of our jurisdiction. They're not really with the
Mhm,
Republic. There's nothing
mhm,
we can do about that.
mhm,
And I think us as an audience and us as fans, we realize like, hey, that's the right thing to do. These people are in need. And I think a lot of times we forget in politics, it's messy making these decisions about,
Yep,
how do we help these people without overextending ourselves and putting ourselves in a bind.
yep,
That's just like real life. That's everyday things.
yep.
You want to help your neighbor, but at what cost?
Thank you for mentioning the sequel trilogy, because our Star Wars today is television. And that movies are right now sort of in a second tier. I mean, everything that they have produced has been television. They
Mhm.
haven't made a movie since
Rise of
Rise of
Skywalker.
Skywalker.
Yeah.
You're right that the sequel trilogy sort of missed the opportunity to add that notion of politics to the mix, but I'm really glad that it is happening on television.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like the prequel trilogy never really gave us a good look on the Clone Wars themselves. And that television did that for us with the animated show between 2008 and 2020. Same thing, I think, is happening with the sequel trilogy that, you know, the New Republic is destroyed in the first movie.
Right.
But we're starting to get glimpses of forming a new space, a new government with Mandalorian, and as you mentioned, with Ahsoka. And it's really interesting to see the politics of center versus periphery. Who's in the outer rim? What matters in the outer rim? What
Right.
does not matter in the outer rim? And it's all about the core, and
Right.
it's all about the core, which is American politics, which is Brazilian politics, which is, I mean, it's just
Everywhere.
so typical of the metropolis is what matters, and the margins are not important until they rebel.
Right.
And
Or
then when they
until it affects our
rebel,
lives.
then they go for there. And the fact that Mandalorian is all happening, most of it is happening out there,
Mm-hmm.
way out there, has everything to do with those are the places where you can get away with murder because it's too far away from the metropolis. It's too far away, in the case of Star Wars, from the core. So I think, Nick, it would be fun now to sort of Star Wars as a reflection of our politics, of our contemporary politics, because it's really interesting to see, once again, how politics changes in the United States and how Star Wars changes with it
Yeah.
in the way that it portrays. I have lots of thoughts on these, so
Me too.
um, why don't you start? I'll let you start, and then I'll go from there.
I think I will say this this is my opinion, my disclaimer. I will say I think when people complain about Star Wars, my least favorite thing ever is Star Wars is woke. Meaning, just
Right,
because there's a person of color, a woman as the
right.
lead of the movie or TV show, all of a sudden that makes it political. Two things. Newsflash: Star Wars has always been political
Yep.
from the inception. And
Yep.
two, I think, like you were just saying, that politics have changed, and not just our world, but I think, in the way that media represents people. When Star Wars was made in the 70s and 80s, there was not a lot of, people of color in leading roles in movies.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Today, that's changed, and it represents more of a how our world is today. There's more people of color that are active, that are more out there, more seen than they've ever been. I think Star Wars is just catching up with the times. That's all I think it is. There's no hidden political agenda. I just wanted to get that out there before we
Oh,
continue.
no, 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 totally, totally. I think the one, even before my book came out, like it was announced that it was coming out. There was this one place which you sent to me,
Oh goodness.
with all of these horrible comments about my book. The book
Really?
hadn't come out, so they hadn't even read the book. And this was one of them was sort of like, could you please put your manuscript in your house and burn it down to the ground so we don't have to read your book? But aside from that, they kept calling it, instead of Star Wars multiverse, they kept calling it Star Wars woke verse.
How creative.
And at the
Oh,
time, I was sort of like, oh yeah, I've heard of that term because it was very new,
oh
at least
yeah.
for me. It was at least for me, and it was just so curious. This whole like this sort of resistance.
I remember this now.
Yeah,
Because you
I,
asked me,
I
like, what does woke mean? Or,
I didn't know
and
what it meant. I didn't know what
yeah.
it meant. I didn't know what it meant. Nick, there's something really sort of both fascinating and difficult about Star Wars when we talk about politics. There's a space in Star Wars for progressives, and there's a space in Star Wars for radically conservatives. And so we have the Empire, and every time the Empire, even if they're the bad ones, even if they lose every story, there's that representation of order and control and security and discipline. And then you have the progressive politics of the rebellion when they are actually being progressive, which is not all the time. And the whole idea of revolution and rebellion and diversity and equity and all of those things. Star Trek doesn't have that. Many other franchises don't have this notion where you can find your politics and insert them in it. And so you can have radically conservative people and just attach themselves to long live the empire, and they can be radical Republicans, conservative retrogrades, openly racist, and that's okay because they're with the bad ones. They're with the empire, and they don't see themselves as the empire. I mean, it's so interesting online where people are sort of like, when are we going to get a movie where the empire are the good guys? I see this all the time, all the time. And so part of the problematics of Star Wars is that you have people who are attracted to Star Wars because of the progressive politics, and you have people attracted to Star Wars because of the very conservative politics of the Empire or the First Order. And so that's the tricky part. Like every time I talk to a fan, I'm always sort of like shuffling my feet. It's like, okay, who's
Which
in
one?
front of me?
Right. Which side of the aisle am I talking to?
Someone who is radically conservative or somebody who is progressive. And so it's really interesting to have that complication. You don't have that as much. I mean, you have elements in Star Trek where you can sort of align yourself conservatively, but the story is very much about progress, very much about progress and progressive politics. In Star Wars, if you want to, you can just stay with the Empire.
Yeah.
Just stay with the Empire, and everything will be okay.
I think another thing I find fascinating is how a lot of people, like I mentioned earlier, the original trilogy is very simple, black and white story. And a lot of people will say Star Wars is woke now. When I was younger, it wasn't like this. It was just good storytelling. I think a lot of things, not just Star Wars, a lot of media, when we're younger, we're not realizing the political messages or the ideologies that are being put in front of us because
Yeah,
we're children. We don't understand these things.
yeah,
There's so many times where I've went back and watched movies from my childhood and realized, oh my God, this movie is about, how war affects people, or this movie is about, Wally for is a good example for me because I was 13 when that movie came out. I had no
uh-huh,
idea. The
uh-huh.
movie is about environmentalism and how we need to take care of our planet, and things like The Incredibles is about how you know overstepping, the government overstepping and overreaching is kind of detrimental. People should just do good because they want to do good.
Hmm.
All these things that we don't notice as kids. I think Star Wars is a prime example of, in the very first movie, they mention the Senate dissolving. They mention, Princess Leia's on it, and she's an ambassador on a diplomatic mission. It's always been there. You just chose to ignore it, or the movie
Uh,
didn't highlight it like they do now,
right.
or TV shows do now. It's always been
I
there.
I I think the presence of Leia in the first movie is politically progressive.
Yeah.
To me, that is a political decision, and what she does to that film, it's woke, as they call it.
Yes.
Having the damsel in distress being the one that saves herself from escaping the jail cell in the Death Star, because Han Solo and Luke Skywalker have no idea what to do except shoot.
Yes.
Um, I mean, those kinds of things.
It
Like,
didn't
how is that
happen.
not?
Yeah.
That's gender politics right there,
Hmm. Well,
right there.
I've seen a
But you're
very
right. You're right. When we're children, we're not necessarily we're seeing that subliminally,
mhm.
but we're not aware of what it means, sort of in the social politics. But it's always been there.
Oh yeah.
Always been there.
You just didn't notice it because
Yeah,
you were
yeah.
not one, you didn't have the knowledge, and two, you were not your brain wasn't developed. You
Yeah,
didn't.
yeah. You were
Yeah.
just. I was just not thinking about that.
Right. Well, and you bring up a good point with Leia. I've seen interesting people talk about, like, if Leia, for if Carrie Fisher from 1977 were to come out today, she would not. She would be like Brie Larson. She would be hated by a certain segment of the fans or certain segments of the population.
Yep.
Uh, I mean, she's telling Han Solo he's incompetent and yelling at him and making fun of Chewbacca. I mean, like, she is really a trailblazer, and we talked about it in our Leia episode. Uh, she's a trailblazer for a reason, because that is kind of what a lot of people
Exactly.
expect from their female leads today. They expect
Mhm.
a Princess Leia, a
Mhm.
strong, independent, forward-thinking woman.
Same thing. Same thing with Lando in Empire. I mean, I remember that adding Lando to Empire was sort of this sort of, okay, we need a black person somewhere in here because there are no black people anywhere in the first movie.
No.
And it is a corporate decision. I don't want to say that it is not, but it is also it does other things besides that. And that's the important point. Having all these women in the sequel trilogy, having all these women in the Clone Wars episode, they are decisions, and they are corporate decisions. However, they have ramifications, and they have sort of like reactions and consequences, and audiences attached to those things.
Right.
I have students in my class that, Rey is Jesus Christ come from heaven. Like Rey did everything for Star Wars when they were 5 or 6 and they saw that movie. Boys and girls. Boys and girls.
Yeah.
And so it's really, the whole notion of this marginalized girl who's been abandoned in the planet, who has survived by herself all this time, who is force sensitive and doesn't even know it. That whole arc is
But you're
just so appealing to all of those kids
well. It's
that
if
saw that movie in 2015.
it's no different than 1977 Luke Skywalker.
Yeah,
It's very similar. It's
yeah,
just gender
yeah,
switch. That's all
yeah,
it is.
yeah, yeah.
And I had a professor tell me one time, and I will never forget this, because she's an African American professor, taught social work, and she had told me, there is people always make a big fuss about diversity hires, and you're only hiring because that person is of color, and they make it a negative thing when in reality, yeah, it should be because of they're of color or because they're gay or because they come from a different background. We're not hiring them for that reason. We're hiring them because they have a different life experience than the
Yes.
person hiring them. And
Yes.
I say the same thing with Star Wars. We're telling the story of, in Star Wars, I think that's one thing I've kind of enjoyed, but also Star Wars doesn't really make a big deal about skin tone or gender. It's just you're a person, you're of this species. But one thing I think it does is it informs the character and informs the story when having a actor like
Hmm.
Diego Luna bring
Right.
something different to the
Right.
story,
Right.
or a character like Jen Erso, a character like Ray, or even Hera, who is kind of a person of color, by maybe by some certain characteristics, certain traits. That bring something different to the story
Yep.
rather than your Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia. So yeah, for that reason, I think diversity is important.
Oh, totally. And it is political.
Yes,
I mean, let's just say it. It is political. It's like
yes, but not
this
for.
is but not in the way that this sort of woke, the way that people use
It's
negatively the
not
way the word
pushing.
woke.
It's not pushing an agenda. It's opening doors to new possibilities.
Correct.
A lot of times people make it a negative thing when it shouldn't be.
I love that the blackness of Finn does not matter in the story of Star Wars,
Nope.
but the blackness of Finns really is important to the audiences of Star Wars. And I love that notion of color blindness, I guess, within the story itself, puts away the notion of race and puts it in a different place, while at the same time, by us audiences seeing a black stormtrooper who decides not to be a stormtrooper anymore, that's an amazing story.
Mm-hmm.
Having a stormtrooper renegade is incredible. Having a black stormtrooper renegade in our world is even more wonderful.
Right.
And so I think it's really important not to forget how the characters in the story relate to our world. And that Rey is a woman and Finn is a black man and Poe is a Guatemalan American. Those things matter.
Mm-hmm.
It matters to the audiences.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know how many times I get student evaluations like, it was so nice having a Latinx professor. It was so nice having a Puerto Rican professor. It was
Mm-hmm.
so nice having a gay professor. I've
Good.
never had a gay professor before. I've never had a Puerto Rican or a Latinx professor before. And it just, those things matter.
Yeah.
Those things matter. I have a fucking PhD too.
Well,
It's not like, oh, you were born in Puerto Rico. Can you teach?
right.
It doesn't work that way. You
Right.
still have to have credentials. You
Mm-hmm.
still have to be
Educated.
prepared and educated for what you do. Affirmative action is diversifying the pool of people that work in that place,
mm-hmm.
and making sure that it is diversified. Ah, ah.
And another thing that I realized, I didn't notice this until I was older. I grew up in a very rural, very white dominated area.
Yeah.
And North Georgia is very, very southern, very conservative. And one thing I was asked when I got to college, and I had that professor that I mentioned earlier, she had asked, because I think at that, if I'm remembering correctly, it's been a minute. I think everybody in that class was Caucasian, and
Wow.
she had asked everybody, "Do you remember having a person of color as a teacher? And if so, when?" And I'm pretty sure majority of that classroom said, "You're the first one," and we're freshmen in college. This is our first year in college, and we're in a very conservative area. So she's,
Right.
if I'm not mistaken, on the campus, she might have been the only person of color teaching. But
Wow.
she had asked that, and that was very thought provoking to me. And I've never even considered that because it's not what I just grew up around what was in front of me and never really thought of
Yeah.
anything different.
Can I don't mean to age you, but what year were you a freshman?
That time I was probably like 2014 or 2015 in college.
Okay.
So
Okay.
about 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago now.
Okay. To be in the United States and to say that in 2015 that was your first black professor,
Correct. And that's wild to think about.
that is just incredible.
And it,
Oh,
in
wow.
public schools different than college and
Of
graduate
course.
school. I've had many teachers now of color, but I never really considered the difference until that question was posed to me.
Yeah.
That's just mind blowing.
All right. I think we can go on, but we can't.
We shouldn't
because we want people to like actually watch the whole
listen to
show.
us. Yeah,
No, but this was really good. This was really
this is a
good. We
good tip.
covered so much.
Yeah,
Oh my goodness, we covered so much.
yeah,
So thank you, Nick, for amusing me and doing an episode on this topic.
yeah. Thank you.
Um,
I love this topic.
because there doesn't seem to be a space to do this. And I'm glad that we are creating a space in order to talk about politics in Star Wars. So
Yeah.
thank you, audience. Thank you,
Yeah.
Nick.
Leave us if you want in some comments below. I want to hear your thoughts on this.
Yes.
And I'd like more engagement in our videos. I would like to hear some
that would be
thoughts.
awesome.
Yeah.
That would be awesome. And if you haven't subscribed yet,
please do.
To our show, please do, so you can get notifications as we continue releasing episodes. We're going to be doing a Phantom Menace episode at the end of the season. So many of the things that we talked about today,
We'll bleed over.
There's more to talk about. There's
Yeah.
more to talk about Phantom Menace.
Definitely.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
May the force be with you.
May the force be with you.